Hello. So today we're going to talk about planning. So we have a couple of topics lined out. We're going to talk about planning. We're going to talk about some various types of planning and kind of how they work. So here's our agenda. We'll follow along and try to finish this up in an hour and leave some room for questions if needed. So the first topic is why do we even want to plan? So let's take a look at our We Build Widgets company. And our We Build Widget company is using the process they've used forever. And here's their current process. So the customer places an order. The customer service person goes, well, I think we can probably have it then. That's when we usually can have it. But here's a guess. I'll tell you when we can have it. After that, the customer service person emails purchasing and production and tells them that this order is coming in and maybe they should buy some stuff and maybe they should build some sub-assemblies to get ready. But it's all kind of handled in email and other communication devices. So time goes by, everybody's kind of doing their job along, and time goes by, and all of a sudden, oh my gosh, the customers called us that we're past due. We're a week past due and we didn't even know we were late. So everybody scurries around. Everybody scurries around, production, purchasing, scurrying around, ordering stuff, building stuff, overtime, expedite charges, everything's going on. And everybody is frustrated and angry, right? Everybody, customers, vendors, everyone. So what happens is production and purchasing compensate with this, and they increase inventory, they increase spending, they increase buying, and the next order comes in and everything just starts over again, right? So it's just this repetitive cycle of planning and scurrying around. So let's say that the We Build Widget company now is going to implement some sort of a planning environment. So our first same things happen is that customer places an order, but now I have some additional tools in my arsenal to understand what I can actually do. So I use a process called ATP or CTP, which we'll talk about in a little bit later, to determine a more realistic ship date based on some factors that we'll also talk about later. Then my purchasing and production people have right at their fingertips, right when the order is placed, the information that they need to act on, to get organized, to act, and to be very proactive in what's happening in the production and purchasing areas. During the time that everyone was kind of scurrying around before, now we're monitoring orders, we're dealing with bigger problems, we're looking at our capacity with APS tools, and we're trying to make we're able now to make good or better decisions. So once the material is received in, the jobs are released at the right time, everything ships on time, the costs are in time, nobody had to work overtime. So now everybody's happy. The puzzle pieces fit and everybody goes on their merry way. So inventory levels and cash flow improve. And now we have our next order and we're in a mode of continuous improvement. So just a little story there to tell you why we would want to plan and what would happen in our environment when we do plan. So the next topic then that we're going to cover is what is APS? So APS is one type of planning tool or engine in the SyteLine CSI arsenal. And so advanced planning and scheduling APS is primarily what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to talk about specifically one kind of APS, but we're going to do some examination of why they're different and what happens and a little bit about the guts of how they work. So APS has one goal. It's allow you to make good promises and deliver what you promised when you promised. So APS's goal is to help you keep your promises. So there's lots of tools. There's not one single thing that's called APS. There's a variety of tools that once you get started using planning systems, you'll have a lot of tools available to help you. So, oops, didn't mean to do that. So right away we've got some tools in order to make a good promise. The other thing that we're going to talk about in APS is that it's inherently lean. So APS is gonna have you buy what you need when you need it to produce what you buy when you need it. If you haven't done that, it's going to alert you that, hey, maybe you can't keep your promise, but it's not going to have you build inventory either from a purchase side or production side. It's not going to have you build up a lot of inventory, build up a lot of costs, and it helps you plan your labor, but it will not level load at in a capacity basis. So if we're talking about APS and just APS, it can run in two different modes. It runs in what's called an infinite mode and a finite mode. And primarily during this presentation, we're going to talk about infinite. That's where most people start. And an infinite APS world, capacity is considered, and it does drop capacity requirements or create for your information capacity requirements, but it does not cap your production and does not tell you that you have to move production to a different day if you're at capacity. It will merely tell you that you're over capacity. So if you look at it this way, if you look at APS running in an infinite environment, it will use what information it has to determine how long a production job will take. So if you look at it as a length of time, but then you look at it that it's going to stack as many jobs as you give it. So as many due dates or as many orders as or demands as it has, it's going to stack those up without hitting any limit. So even if you can only run 5 jobs a day for that item, it will stack as many as you put on. So 100 a day or whatever. So infinite deals with duration timing, where with finite, you have very clear view of what your capacity is at each resource or resource group. And that capacity then not only drives the job duration, it drives when the job should start and how many jobs can be produced on a given day. Typically, we start with infinite and move people into finite. Finite requires a lot of capacity data. So in summary, APS is going to take your demand plan and look at your production plan, look at the procurement plan, and put all of this together and create a harmonized plan. So it's looking at so many different factors all at one time and creates this final plan of what you should do and where you should go. The note to take here is that it's completely and 100% data driven. So you've got to have good data, and we're going to talk about some of those really important data points a little bit later on, but you've got to have good data in the right places that's accurate. It also means that APS is kind of a living organism, right? So it's your planning information is always changing. It's always got to be kept up to date. Your inventory levels are always changing. Those have to be kept up to date. So it's just important to understand how much it's all data driven, because the system only knows what you've told it. So APS in its planning will do this. It will allow you to make a promise. So it helps you tell a customer or tell your demand what day is realistic to promise given the data that I have. So given lead times, given production times, here's when you will be able to deliver this item. The next thing it does is allows you to plan. And by planning, it's going to offer suggestions, just like you're used to in MRP, but it's going to offer suggestions about building or buying. It's going to look at what you have. It's going to determine what you need, when you need it, and it's going to determine when you should do activities to get your supply in line to meet your demand. So the next thing we're going to do is execute. We're going to execute on our jobs that need to be created in our purchase orders so that we can follow the APS suggestions and get everything in and produced when we say we're going to do it. APS also includes a variety of tools, also known as forms. Of course, there's millions of forms, but there's many, many forms that will help you manage what's going on. So you'll know when an order is late. You'll know when it's late before it's late. You'll know when you could know it's late when you enter it. So you've got a lot of tools to manage this. You know when an order is late. You know when a purchase order needs to be moved. You know when you're over capacity so that if you have the capability, you can flex that capacity, you can work overtime, you can bring in some more resources to resolve those issues. You can move the due date. So all of this whole package of tools is really considered APS. I know there's one form that's APS planning, but the reality is it's really this set of tools that you use to promise, plan, execute, and then resolve issues. And APS is in play the entire process. So Heather, is there any questions so far?
None that I see at this point. Thank you, Cindy.
Mm-hmm. So the next topic is we've talked about 3 different planning engines that are available in SyteLine CSI. And those 2 of them are APS, finite and infinite. And the other one that's available is MRP. So these 2 things are not the same. One is not an upgraded version of the other. Neither are an upgraded version of any of the others, but they just think differently. So we have to talk about how they think differently, and I like to assign them little personalities, but they think and act just differently. So for the next little bit, we'll go over a summary of how APS and MRP is different. In this little bit of conversation, we won't make a lot of distinction between finite and infinite. There are some fine points that come into play, but mostly it's just a difference in the approach and how APS thinks versus MRP. So the first point is that APS plans on a per demand basis, where MRP does not. So MRP looks at the bill of materials. So if you notice that each of these bills here, each of these things is a bill of material based on a demand, either a job or an order, or one of the other demand types. MRP starts at the lowest level and will plan what you need to do at this entire level of the BOM. Then it goes up a level and so forth and plans through the whole process. APS takes that process and kind of flips it on its side and says, you know what, instead of planning demand by or level by level, I'm going to plan demand by demand. So I'm going to go down the whole demand level or up, depending on how you're looking at it. And it's going to say, here's what you need to do to support this demand. And so now I know what's going on with this demand. And then I'm going to take the next one and the next one and the next one. And then I'm going to look at similar items and put them together and base my plans and suggestions and my execution and suggestions off of each individual item. So just starting out, the whole way that the 2 systems or the 2 approaches think is somewhat different. APS only plans in the future. So what happens with APS is a bit like I like to think of it in terms of GPS. So I'm going to a wedding and the champagne is going to be served at 6 o'clock. Okay, and I know it's about a 3-hour drive. And so I'm going to leave there and I'm going to leave there to get in time for the champagne to be served. And I'm going on, I'm going to drive on the road and I don't know what the road conditions are. I don't know where the bumps might be. I don't know where the traffic might be, but I know it takes me about 3 hours to go. So I'm going to leave at 3 o'clock. Now, if I'm really thinking about it, I'm going to get on my phone earlier in the day and I'm going to look at my GPS, which works exactly like MRP. I'm sorry, which is exactly like APS. Too many letters. The GPS works exactly like APS, where it's saying, you know what, there's some traffic in the road. So if you leave now, here's what time it's going to get there. If you leave now, here's what time you're going to get there. If you had not used your GPS and only relied on MRP, MRP would tell you, you should have left earlier, you should have left earlier, you should have left earlier. But it's not going to tell you when you're going to get there. It's going to tell you you should have started earlier. So a vastly different thinking methodology about how the system plans. APS will only look forward and says, you know, if you haven't left now, you can't leave in the past. So I'm only going to plan forward. And that's probably the largest differentiation between APS and MRP. So MRP is going to tell you, you should have left, you should have done this, you should have ordered it, you should have done it. But with APS, it's going to tell you, oh, you didn't do it. If you start now, here's when you can do it. So an important difference between APS and MRP. The next difference between APS and MRP is that you have real-time updates to plan. MRP, I know when I was using it years and years ago, was you know, an 8-hour run. I know now it doesn't. It's runs very shortly and efficiently, but it really is based. Your visibility is based from run to run, and MRP. APS gives you some additional real-time update capability to make your plans. And those real-time updates are called get ATP and get CTP, depending on whether you're finite or infinite. And what this is going to do for you is, as you're entering an order or a forecast or one of the other types of demands, you can actually, the system will actually tell you, based on what I know right now, and there again, since I can only start right now, but based on what I know right now, here's when you can have this done. And so it's looking out and saying, you can have this when you want it, or you can't. And you can do that as you go, order by order, every single time, if you want to. So I'm not going to read all of this. Heather, the presentation is associated with the recording, right? So you can go over this at your leisure, but get ATP and get CTP is a manual plan for that demand. It's you ask it, can you meet this due date? And it comes back and it tells you, yes, I can, no, I can't, or I can partially meet that demand. So get ATP and get CTP is right away. It's going to give you immediate feedback. It's also going to give you a really cool looking graphic of a plan detail that's going to tell you exactly what it's thinking and how it's thinking and why it's thinking that. So get ATP, get CTP, very, very powerful tools. The other side of APS is that you do also run it on a schedule. So get ATP, get CTP is in addition to APS planning on a schedule. Same kind of MRP rules apply. You don't want to run it, 15 times a day, but you do want to run it at night or once during the day. So when you run APS planning, it's going to wipe everything out and start over again. It's going to wipe all its plans out and start over again, because in keeping with the thinking that I only know what I can do today, I only know what I can do starting today. So it's going to replan your system, and it's going to update those plans with the latest, most accurate planning information that it has. So APS also runs and works in conjunction with Material Planners Workbench, just like MRP did, and it is going to give you all of the appropriate suggestions. So that's the difference between Get ATP and APS planning, but it's also a huge difference in APS versus MRP, in that APS gives you this additional on-demand tool. Some of the other kind of differences that we're not going to spend as much time on is that APS uses BOM operation times. So whatever you've got set up in your routings as operation times is what APS is going to use, which means you can vary operation times by item. MRP is going to use your item lead times in terms of setting production duration and when items are needed. The other things that APS can do that MRP doesn't do quite as well is you can set up an automatic expedite for purchase parts. We're not going to go into that a lot, but that means if a purchase part can't arrive based on the lead time, you can set up an alternate lead time that says, use this if you can't meet that. So while MRP will give you a suggestion to expedite or tell you, or an error message to tell you to expedite, APS will actually do that for you automatically if you set up expedited lead times on purchase parts. APS will also create a schedule, a load plan, a capacity plan. APS will tell you based on the routing information that it has what jobs should be going through this work center at this particular date and time. And so it will also give you, even if Infinite will give you some information around what your capacity is, what items should be being produced at certain times or certain days, and gives you some planning tools around what you need to do with your workforce. And obviously, and if we turn on finite, then we can set that capacity and actually use it. So we've talked a lot about what APS does and kind of the philosophy around it, and its personality and its personality difference between MRP. I wanted to just kind of quickly go over some of the terminology that I've already been using and make sure that we're very clear. I think it's important when you start an APS implementation or start to think about APS that everyone understands what the terminology used. So we're going to go from there. APS uses a demand. So it's two primary inputs and outputs are demands. So from a demand standpoint, you can have different types of demands. A demand can be a customer order, it can be safety stock, a forecast, job orders, or production schedules. So all manner of demands are considered by APS. It doesn't really leave anything out. The supply, which will come in to meet the demand. So the supply will be planned or used to satisfy the demands. So as supply goes, it's going to look to inventory first, and then it will give you it's going to look to inventory first and existing purchase orders and existing jobs and existing transfer orders. and existing production schedules. All of those constructions will provide a supply which will meet the demand. There are some ways to set priorities, and we'll talk about priorities and how they work in a little bit, but priorities, basically APS says the due date is the due date. The due date is when I want to ship this, so I'm going to work around meeting my demand due date and trying to make that work. It also calculates manufacturing lead time based on data in the operation and the routing steps. It can calculate purchasing lead times based on the information stored at the item level. So it knows how to plan your items based on the purchasing lead time. And it also has a pretty robust parameter controls. There's a planning parameters form that will drive a lot of the behavior of both MRP and APS. APS has extended those parameter controls to some additional tabs with some additional information for finite and some fine-tuning capability that's also available on the planning parameters. So what's going to happen with APS is that the first thing it's going to do when it sees a demand, it's going to figure out when I need to get it, right? So when do I need to have this demand done? And the first thing I'm going to do then is determine my manufacturing duration. If I don't have any inventory, I'm going to figure out my manufacturing duration. Once I figure out my manufacturing duration, and there again, this is all based on a couple of settings, parameter settings, it may work slightly differently. Once I determine my manufacturing duration, then I know when my purchased items are needed in the course of that manufacturing length of time, or whenever I'm going to need this on the floor. So once I do that, I can determine where my purchase component requirements lie in terms of timing. And now I can take my purchase requirements and use my purchasing information to understand when I need to take action. So it's using both the manufacturing duration and the purchasing duration to line up suggestions of when I need to take various actions. The system definitely lines up your demands by due date. And I like to think of this like a kindergarten lunch line. So you're in the kindergarten lunch line, right? And the lunch lady has some green beans, and she's got like 100 of them, and she's handing out the green beans. So we line up by due date, maybe age, we line up by due date. And the kindergarten lady, my green beans are my inventory. So the lunch lady is handing out green beans and handing out green beans and handing out green beans. When those 100 green beans are gone, the very next person in line may have to wait until I either buy some more green beans or I open another can, right? So it's going to consume your inventory based on due date priority until that inventory or already scheduled supplies are utilized. Then it's going to start giving you suggestions for what you have to purchase or make to satisfy the rest of those demands. So the other thing that we talk about with APS is that as orders come in, the line may be different tomorrow. So the line is the line, and all of those demands are going to line up by due date, and I'm going to get handed out green beans until I run out. So once they line everybody up, now they're gonna hand out the supply. Once my existing supply is gone, and that's a soft assignment on APS. Once my existing supply is gone, then I'm going to start suggesting that I open purchase orders, that I open jobs in order to meet any additional demand and any kids that are still waiting in line. Oops, all right. Okay, So APS makes certain assumptions. APS always assumes, and these are very important to understand because when we talk about personalities, one of APS's demands is that you're going to do what I say. So APS always assumes that you're going to follow the plan. So APS just assumes every day that you're going to do what I tell you to do. If you don't do what I tell you to do, or you don't follow what you've already set up or that you've already said you're going to do, you need to. And if you don't, I'm going to replan it starting today. So APS is always going to assume that you're going to follow the plan. So once you set those dates and set that data, APS assumes that you're going to follow the plan. So what fields are we using that impact this whole planning system? What fields are important when we talk about, because we've talked about the importance of data, but we also want to talk about which data fields those are at a very high level. So the first thing to understand is that APS is very much date driven. And when I say date, it really is date time driven, but for this purposes of this conversation, we'll just talk about dates. So APS is very, very date sensitive and considers everything around dates. And the first and most important date that APS has is the due date. So the due date is what APS plans to. APS is going to tell you yes or no. You can hit the due date or you cannot. So keep in mind that that original due date, or the first due date that gets set, particularly on an order line, uses your standard due days to calculate your starting endpoint for due dates. So you can set the standard due dates at a variety of levels, but that's going to be your first hit, your first suggestion, if you will, at a due date. Of course, you can change the due date, you can override it, you can set the due date based to what your customer is asking for, you can set the due date for what you think you're going to do, but the due date, it's a requirement on the order line. It's the most important date that APS uses. The requested date is relatively informational. APS will manage that a little bit for you if you're using Get ATP or Get CTP. But the requested date is an informational date that says the customer requested this date, and I can't, I'm not going to be able to meet that, or I am going to be able to meet it. You can run various reports by requested date, but the requested date says, here's where my customer actually wanted it, but here's my due date that I'm actually going to ship it on. APS then is going to do its whole thing and come back with what's called the projected date. The projected date is calculated by APS, and we're going to look at that calculation in a little bit more detail in a little bit. So the projected date is what APS says you can do. And what it's going to say is, here's your due date. I'm going to look at all the factors that we've already talked about. And here's when you can have this item ready. Based on all the data you've given me, here's when you can have it ready. If that projected date, the projected date is always going to be the due date. It's going to say, you said it was due on this day. That's your promise. I'm going to help you meet your promise. So the projected date is not the earliest date you can have it. The projected date is what APS is saying is you can meet the due date or you can't. If I can't meet the due date, I'm going to tell you when you can first have it. And we'll take a look at that calculation in a little bit more detail. There are data fields on the routings, on the operations that impact APS, all of your fixed hours, are listed out there. So when you set up an operation, you've got some fixed hours, you've got some variable hours. Fixed hours are runts per job, variable hours are multiplied by the job release quantity. All of that calculation goes into calculating the duration and the start and end time of that particular operation. That's important because not only are we're going to give our capacity information and our load information based on that production duration, we're also going to understand where our purchase components need to come into the system based on that duration. So it's very important to have accurate operation hours and days in the data. On the item, there are several planning related fields, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more in some of the graphics later on. But on the lead time, on the planning tab, there's lead times. The planning system does work on the lead times from the item master, not the lead times on the vendor contracts. So in order to plan, you've got to get a lead time for your purchase components. That's the average or what you expect it to be. And these need to be also as accurate as possible. The lead time for manufactured items will roll up from the operations, but the lead time for purchase components need to be added at the item master. Oops, keep doing that. So once the planning system determines when something is needed, and the projected date and when I should do all this stuff and when the purchase order should be issued and when the item should be received and all of that, then the planning system will use some additional data fields that kind of impact your planning. So some examples of those are some minimums and maximums and multiples. So you don't want to, for example, plan a purchase order for every screw that you're going to use, for example, right? So I have this thing that I buy in lots of 50. So the planning system is saying, hey, you're going to run out of that. It's our GPS. You're going to run out of that in 3 months. So in 3 months, you should place a purchase order and your order minimum is 100. You should place it, the purchase order for 100. Then I'm not going to give you any other suggestions until I see that you're going to run out of that particular component. So once APS establishes that you need something, then those other planning data comes into play and will moderate your suggestions based on the additional planning. Day supply is always a little bit confusing. Day supply is used for a consolidation algorithm. So day supply will moderate your quantities that it's recommending that you order by combining multiple days of demand for that particular component. So very important fields on the item master that need to be set for APS to work accurately. Well, it's really for any planning system to work accurately. Okay, so we've talked about that the projected date is the most important date around that APS works on. So let's take a look at all of those various, kind of pulling together all of the various pieces of information that we've seen around dates, around lead time, around planning data and some other things. Actually look at how APS determines those projected dates. So the first thing to understand is that the purchasing planning fields have a decided impact on suggestions. So the purchasing planning fields are going to tell you when you need to issue the purchase order in order to get in order to get the item here in time. So this is really mostly purchased components that are using these different fields in the item master to determine when it's needed. If we say that that the line is the required due date, not the required date, not the due date, it's the required date of when it's needed in manufacturing based on the manufacturing duration, then I'm going to start backing up and I'm going to say, okay, I've got some dock to stock time. That means what do I need to do to it after it arrives? After the stuff arrives, I've got to unbox it, or I've got to sort it into different stacks, or I've got to combine stuff. So I need some time after it arrives until it's ready to go on the product. The lead time is my vendor lead time that says my purchase order, when my purchase order goes to the vendor, he's going to take this long to get that to me. And that's when I need for it to arrive at my dock. So I can actually use dock to stock time to give me some additional buffer or cushioning on that arrival. So I want to put my lead time so that my item arrives. I'm going to use my dock to stock time to sort it and push it. The other piece that impacts a purchasing planning time is your paperwork time. And paperwork time is what you need ahead of submitting it to the vendor to make sure that you have everything in order. If you have to pull together any specification documents or any drawing documents or get various levels of approval that takes some time, then a paperwork time will help you just increase the amount of warning that you get that you need to create a purchase order. So that is contained inside of the whole plan to purchase. So then we can move on and talk about APS scheduling. So APS scheduling works or it's actually creating a projected date. Actually, it works in 2 passes. And the first pass is a backwards pass. So the first pass starts with, and these reference CO due date. Obviously, if you have a forecast or a safety stock, that's a different date, but it's going to start with the due date or the date the demand is required. And it says, okay, here's my due date. And I'm going to go backwards from that. And I'm going to say, here's my manufactured lead time, taking all of those components and all of those fields we saw on the routing. It's going to add all those up and say, this thing is going to take me this long to make. So the length of the arrow, it's going to take me this long to make. And depending on how I have certain settings, it will either tell me I need to have my purchase components at the beginning or at the end of certain manufacturing supplies. In this case, we're going to say I need this component kind of a little bit after I start this manufacture. Let's say it's a job, this manufacturing supply. So now I've figured out my manufacturing lead time. Once again, if you're running infinite, remember these can be all stacked on top of each other, but I've figured out my manufacturing lead time. The next thing then I do is I say, okay, from this manufacturing lead time, from this manufacturing required date, I know my entire purchasing lead time. So that purchasing lead time box is the 3 fields that we saw earlier. So the purchasing lead time then is put ahead of that. So we know when we need it or when we need to issue that purchase order to get it in here in time. All of that says, all of that says, if I started today, would I meet the due date? And if I do meet this due date, if I can get everything done by the due date, I'm going to set the projected date equal to the due date. I'm not going to try to get it done. This could be 6 months away or 10 months away or 3 months away, but I'm not going to set it any earlier than the due date. So that's the first pass. And if I'm happy with that, if I'm happy that I can do that, then I'm done and I'm not going to make the second pass. If I can't hit that due date, now I'm going to turn right back around and do a forward schedule pass that once again starts with today, because I can't start any earlier than today. So I'm going to start with today and go forward now with the same thing. Here's my purchasing lead time. Since I've already determined that I can't hit my due date, I can use my expedited if I need to. Then my manufacturing lead time comes in. That's the same length, that hasn't changed. And here's my due date. But now my due date is going to be late because my manufacturing can't be done until after the due date. So what APS is going to do is it's going to set now my projected date to a date after my due date. That is the date based on all of the data that I have that I'm going to be able to meet. Now, if I'm looking at that demand, I can tell, and I can tell well in the future that it's going to be late. That now I have tools where I can examine what my projected date is against my due date, and I know what I'm going to be late on. So it's very important. The projected date then becomes what everything plans to. So you're going to want to keep in mind and keep this differential, the differential between the projected date and the due date, as small as possible. But APS 2 passes, so it pretty much takes advantage of both the forward and backward scheduling aspects of MRP and tells you when you can have the item ready. Okay. So creating a planning environment is not simple. It's difficult. And there again, we've talked about over and over again, valid data. Valid data is the single most important thing that was going to make APS successful. APS is a large, it's a large function, and it needs to have all valid data. The data, getting the data accurate, keeping the data accurate is a journey. It's going to take some time. So you don't want to go out there with some mediocre inventory numbers and turn APS on and say, oh, this doesn't work at all. This can't make it work. So always keeping your data, getting your data refined, making it more accurate, making it more valid is a complete journey that you need to be on, and get some feedback loops in place and get that data put together as accurately as possible. The other thing is, so that's the data side. Keep in mind that you also need to model your production environment accurately. You need to understand how long things will take in production. You need to understand where they need to be. You need to understand how many transactions you're going to use. You need to make sure that people are doing their transactions. And so you want to make sure that you have everything put together so that your data model very closely matches your real environment. This becomes even more important as you try to move to finite and try to move your capacity data. You're trying to use your very static capacity data in order to give you even more accurate projected dates. And the other thing about APS, and we've touched on this a couple of times in the course of the conversation, is APS is always going to assume you will act on the suggestions. So all subsequent suggestions assume that you already did the first one. So in other words, I'm not going to suggest another purchase order, because I'm pretty sure you should create the purchase order I'm telling you to create, with the due date that I tell you to create it, and the quantities that I tell you to create it in. And I know you're going to do that, and I trust you, and you need to do it. If you don't do it, I'm just going to start over again tomorrow. The other point to make here in terms of implementing APS or getting started on APS, and I like this graphic because it it points out that APS is an entire business process. APS relies on most of the business activities and functions to make it correct. It's not simply a planning area function or a purchasing area function. Everyone from the engineers who are creating the accurate bills of materials, to the manufacturing engineers with accurate routings, to order entry, giving reasonable dates, all of the business functions have a feed into APS and get a return from APS in terms of a more organized and more free, a more smoothly flowing life. So it is an entire business function that a lot of people have impact and outputs from. So not just one area of the business, it relies on the entire business to make it successful. And the last thing that I wanted to point out was to keep in mind all of your inputs and outputs. Just a simple chart that shows your inputs are going in the planning engine, whether you use APS or MRP, it's going into the planning engine and it's giving you back out dates, plans. So plans would be MRP. With APS, you get projected dates, you get those same suggestions with messages. You also get a load profile. You do get some supply pegging, depending on how you have it set up. And you get exception messages in both APS and MRP. So there again, I think that planning is hugely important. It takes some dedication to get it going, but it will certainly smooth out your life for a lot of different functions and a lot of different areas of the business. And it's a nice tool. And that is all I have. We kind of covered everything for today. We made it through all of the different topics.
Nice,
And
Cindy.
I
Hey,
hope
Cindy, I've got a question for you, just in your experience, because you talked about some of those important things that are necessary to make this work, and that it's a journey and all that. Customers you've worked with that have done it and done it well, and those that aren't, what's the difference culturally and leadership wise in those companies?
Well, leadership is huge. You have to have a leadership component from the executive level down to make this work. The other piece at kind of and I would say not even from an executive or level, but from a supervisor, let's say a supervisor's level, is to not give up. That's what I've seen people fail at, is they turn it on and the suggestions aren't what they expect. So instead of researching it and figuring out the data, they just give up and say, well, this will never work. So I think that leadership all the way down from the executives to the supervisors, to the people on the floor who are tasked and feel a responsibility to do the transactions, that every transaction is important, to the engineers who when you go back to them and say, hey, the bill, you may need to tweak this bill. It's calling for this, and it doesn't need to, setting those feedback loops into place. And those people who can keep their inventory accurate are usually the most successful.